If you would like to learn how to create a super smooth, solid paint finish on furniture using chalk paint, well then just keep watching. Hey, I'm Deanna. Welcome to my studio, and thanks so much for joining me for part 3 of this dresser makeover. In this video, I'm going to be painting the body of the dresser using chalk paint, and my goal is to create the smoothest finish possible without using a paint sprayer. Yes, you can use a paint sprayer to apply chalk paint, but I'll save that topic for another video. In order to create a smooth paint finish, you first need to start with a smooth surface. There were quite a few scratches on my dresser, as well as quite a bit of the stain was flaking off. I've done a bit of prep work to get the dresser to this stage. If you'd like to see what I've done so far, click the links in the description below to watch parts 1 and 2 of this dresser makeover series. If the existing stain or paint on your furniture piece is in relatively good condition, you do not need to sand first for chalk paint to adhere to the surface. Most projects will require no prep work, no sanding, no priming, and that is what I love about chalk paint. So let's get started. I'm going to share with you my tips, process, and favorite tools for both brushing and rolling chalk paint to create a smooth finish. At the end of the video, I'm going to compare and contrast the process and results between brushing and rolling, so make sure you watch all the way to the end of the video so you don't miss a thing. Let's start with rolling. Now, a good quality roller makes a huge difference. Let's take a look at my top 3 favorite rollers for creating a smooth chalk paint finish. This is a low nap roller. Nap refers to the length of the hair. Longer hairs will result in a bumpy orange peel texture on a smooth surface, so low nap is key for painting smooth on a smooth surface. Out of these 3 rollers, this one will leave the most texture because it does have longer hairs than these 2, but because of that, it also holds more paint, which generally means it puts the coats on a little thicker, which would result in less coats of paint and a quicker process for you. A high quality sponge roller leaves a super smooth finish. It has no nap or hairs to this, so the paint goes on in very thin layers. This may mean you might have to do additional coats to get solid coverage. Be cautious of inexpensive sponge or foam rollers that aren't very dense. Sometimes when you're rolling, they'll leave little air bubbles on the surface, and those pop and can leave circular marks, which you don't want to see on your smooth finish. This one here is a flocked foam roller. It's like a sponge roller, but it has some very tiny hairs, so it's kind of the best of both worlds. I did notice that after washing and reusing this a couple of times, some of the little hairs tend to come out and get stuck in your paint finish. Whereas with these 2, I've washed and reused many times over without any issue. So it's just something to keep in mind that this one you might use once or twice and then throw out. For this project, I'm going to give the flocked foam roller a try. All 3 of these are going to do a really great job, so it doesn't matter which one you choose. And I'll be sure to leave a link in the description below to all of the products I'm mentioning in this video, so you can find them if you'd like to recreate this finish. I've got a tin of chalk paint by SLOAN in the color graphite. I've also got my flocked foam roller and handle, a paint tray, and a small craft brush that I'm going to be using to cut in on the edges and the detailed areas. I'm going to start off on this side here, so I'll pour some paint out and talk you through the steps as I go. I'm going to start with my craft brush, and I'll use this to get into the details and the tight spaces where my roller can't quite fit into, and I'm just going to put on a very thin layer of paint. When doing a smooth finish, I like to work in one section at a time, so I'm going to focus just on this side for right now. I dip my brush into the paint, and then beginning with this detailed area down here, applying a very thin layer of the graphite chalk paint. And I'm just really pressing and spreading the paint out. And then while the paint is still wet, I'll take my roller and I'm just gonna roll over the areas I've just cut in with that brush to help minimize the appearance of the brush strokes and avoid the paint drying here and creating a hard line. I'll get my roller as close as I can to this edge and just feather out this cut line. I even like to roll gently over top of the details just to smooth it out a little bit more. And I'll do the exact same thing along this top edge here. Because chalk paint does dry fast, and especially on such a thin layer, you do have to work quite quickly. So now that my top and bottom sections are cut in, I'm going to move right on to rolling. So while your cut lines are still fresh, load some paint onto your roller and roll it out at the top of the tray. You want the paint evenly distributed on the roller and a substantial amount there so that you can see that it's evenly coated, but it's not dripping off the roller. Start near the edge of your furniture piece, and with a light pressure, just start to run the roller up and down the surface, working right into your cut lines. You can go back and forth to press out the paint a couple of times, but try not to overwork it. And then work to feather this edge off so it's not a solid hard line. Load some more paint onto your roller and continue to work in sections, rolling with the wood grain. Roll your next section into the wet edge. And it's okay to overlap the strokes. Avoid pushing really hard with your roller. Doing so might create a hard line or a ridge that you will see when it dries. Now, because my paint is still wet and I've created this hard line, I can lightly go over and feather that out. Now, if that hard line had dried, you could lightly sand it out before going on to the next coat, but it's just less work if you avoid creating those hard lines right from the get-go. At this point, it looks a little patchy and uneven, and I can see the underneath wood color in a couple of spots. Don't worry, that's perfectly normal at this stage. I just have to wait for this first coat to dry, and then I'll move on to do a second coat, and it's going to dry quite quickly because it's so thin. I can already see here where I've cut in, and the paint is more flat, versus here where it's still wet, it's a little bit more shiny. So as soon as it's dry, I'll move on to coat number 2. I can see that my paint is now dry, and it feels dry to the touch. I'm going to go ahead and do the second coat the same way I did the first, cutting in the detailed areas and then moving on to rolling the flat surface. My second coat of rolled paint is dry and I'm ready to move on. It took about twice as long to dry, so it's been sitting for about 30 minutes. And I've noticed that I can still see little bits of the wood showing through in some areas. So I've decided to go ahead and do a third coat in the same way that I rolled the first and the second. I did end up with one tiny spot with a little bit of a ridge, so I'm going to lightly sand that and then go ahead and move on to my third coat of paint. The idea behind creating a smooth finish with a brush is the same with the roller. You want to apply very thin layers of paint and build up the layers to get your solid coverage. For this side, I'm going to be using my SLOAN oval medium-sized paintbrush, and I've also got my little craft brush handy in case there's any tight spaces that this nice full round brush can't quite fit into. I'll be using the same color graphite chalk paint, and I'm just going to pour a little bit more out into my tray. Just start with a little bit of paint on the tips of your bristles. You don't need much to start. And then begin painting by spreading the paint out as thinly as you can on the surface. Reload your brush as you need to. Remember, it's okay if you see the underneath wood color at this point. The goal is to get it on as thin as possible. You'll notice that I'm really pushing the paint out in every which direction to spread it out as thinly as I can. And continuing to work up from my wet edge. You'll notice that I'm brushing in every which direction and not in perfect straight lines. The type of brush I'm using is ideal for this technique to really press out the paint as thin as possible, which will really help to minimize the look of brush strokes. If I had a square flat brush, it wouldn't be as sturdy, it's just quite a bit more floppy, and it wouldn't work as well for this technique. And I think the advantage of this technique is that it goes a little bit quicker than painting all perfect in one direction. And it really allows me to push the paint out as smooth and as fine as possible. And just like the side that I rolled, we'll have to wait for this side to dry before I can move on to the next coat. At this point, it does look a little patchy and uneven, and that's perfectly normal. And the second coat will help it to look much more solid. The first coat of the brushed side has also dried quite quickly. It was dry again in less than 15 minutes, so I'm ready to go on and add a second coat. I'm going to brush the second coat using the same techniques as the first layer. Just a little bit of paint on my brush and pressing it out as thin as I can in all directions. To paint the details in the front frame, I'm going to use this little craft brush again, exactly the same as I did on the sides where I was cutting in, just pressing the paint out nice and thin, avoiding creating any pooling or puddles in these ridges, and building up those thin layers to get a nice smooth finish. The first layer on this frame is now dry, so I'm going to go ahead and do a second coat using the craft brush and following with my roller to smooth out as I go. Before I do the final review of brushing versus rolling, I'm going to share with you a few bonus tips based on the two most common questions that I get regarding creating a smooth chalk paint finish. The first question is, do you need to sand between layers of paint? Personally, I usually don't sand between my layers of chalk paint unless I have an imperfection that I'm trying to fix. Here's why. I don't mind the look of a little bit of roller or brush texture. I think that sanding takes more time to complete the project. It also makes a bit of a dusty mess, and you usually end up doing an extra coat of paint. It's not wrong to sand between your layers of chalk paint. It will help to create an even smoother look, and if that's what you are wanting, then go for it. So here are my tips for sanding between layers of chalk paint to help you get started. Always use a very fine sandpaper. Something like a 400 grit should do the trick. A mechanical sander like a palm sander is going to be too strong and it'll likely wear right through your paint. So you're going to have to do this part by hand. I like to wrap my sandpaper around a sanding block so there's no hard pressure points from my fingers. You could also use a sanding sponge for this technique. When sanding fresh chalk paint, avoid pushing hard. You don't want to wear through the paint just to soften that top layer of texture. See how the color changes when I sand? Don't worry, when you apply the wax sealer, it will take away the dusty look. And remove all of the paint dust before applying your next layer of paint or your wax sealer. The second question is, do you add water to thin the paint? Most of the time, I do not add water to this paint. I like to use the paint just as it is because you get great coverage with a nice thick paint like this. And it's less likely to have drips and runs because of the thicker consistency. And I've noticed on darker colors like this graphite, too much water added in can change the color. If you'd like to try adding water to your chalk paint, here are my tips. Always put some paint into a container or a tray. It's much easier to see how much water you're adding rather than just pouring some water into the can. If your paint in the container or tray has been sitting out for a while and it starts to get a little bit thick, instead of adding water right into the container, try this first. Dip your paintbrush into some water, squeeze out the excess water so it's not dripping but still damp, then dip your brush into your paint. There should be enough moisture in the bristles to thin the paint slightly so when you go to apply your paint, it lays down even smoother. If you do want to add water, try spraying a little on your paint in the tray or container rather than pouring. It takes very little water to thin this paint, so just add a little at a time. Thinning the paint can help to minimize the look of brush strokes. Just keep in mind that thinner paint equals less coverage, which could mean additional coats of paint. I'm all finished with painting for now. Are you ready to take a closer look at the two sides? This is the rolled side. The rolling application took a little longer than the brushing technique that I used on the other side. It took 3 coats of paint to get to solid coverage. The paint dried very quickly. The first layer was just under 15 minutes, and the additional layers took about 30 minutes each to dry. Looking at it up close, it's very smooth and solid, and I don't see any really hard lines from where I was cutting in at the bottom or the top. However, I do see a hint of a line here and there from the direction my roller was going. If I wanted to soften this, I could try lightly sanding, and then when I apply my wax sealer, that should even everything out. When I zoom in really close, you can see that there is some texture from the roller, which is to be expected. This could be softened with a very light sanding if you wanted to, but it's not necessary. This is the brushed side. These brush layers were very quick and easy to apply because of that all-over technique that I used. And it only took 2 coats to get solid coverage on this side. The drying time was the same as the rolled side. Although the brush marks themselves are very fine, when you step back, you can kind of see a bit of visual movement. And that comes from that back and forth sweeping motion that I applied the paint in. Now, if I had applied everything very linear with the wood grain, you would likely still see the direction of the brush strokes, but it would be more uniform in an up and down manner. I'm going to zoom in to show you the brush stroke texture. Yes, you can see the brush strokes, but they are very fine. And just like the rolled side, a little texture is to be expected. There is always the option of lightly sanding if you wanted to soften these lines. Both brushing and rolling used about the same amount of paint. When I started the project, this was a brand new liter of chalk paint, and now it's down about an inch and a half. You can see here roughly how much I've used. If I were to also paint the top and the drawers and the legs, I suspect it would take it down to about half a liter of paint, which gives you an idea that you could easily paint 2 medium-sized dressers from 1 liter of chalk paint. So what do you think? Is rolling or brushing the better way to create a smooth chalk paint finish? Head down to the comments below and let me know, which one are you going to try? Now I want to remind you that chalk painting is meant to be an easygoing, creative process that produces a handcrafted result. Sometimes we put a little too much pressure on ourselves to make the finish perfect. We can really be our own worst critics. This sometimes takes the joy out of painting. So I want to remind you, don't sweat the small stuff, avoid perfectionism, and just enjoy the process. This dresser makeover is not quite done yet. Thanks to everyone who left your feedback on my last video. The question was, do I paint the drawer fronts to match the sides in the frame or leave them wood? A couple of you suggested leaving them wood for now so we could see how it looks. So let me know at this point, what do you think? Keep them wood or paint them to match the sides and the frame? I'm still not going to reveal my entire plan for this dresser, so stay tuned for part 4. Remember to subscribe and click the notification bell so you're alerted when I upload that video. And if you'd like some behind the scenes looks at what I've got planned, remember to follow me on Instagram as well at DIY Deanna. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you back here next time.